Imagine assembling the largest ground force your military has produced in 3 years of war. More than 100,000 soldiers, 18 brigades, 8 full divisions, elite tank armies that carry names recognized across decades of Russian military history. You concentrate them along a single strategic axis. You supply them. You position them. You brief your president that this will be the decisive blow. And then, without losing a single major engagement, without giving up significant territory, without matching your enemy soldier for soldier or tank for tank, your opponent begins methodically starving that entire force into paralysis from the inside, not by breaking through your lines, by cutting everything behind them. That is not a hypothetical scenario. That is what has been unfolding across eastern Ukraine since the opening months of 2026, and the mechanism behind it is one of the most operationally significant developments of this entire war. To understand what Ukraine has done, you first have to understand what Russia was attempting. Since the earliest phase of this war, Russian strategic planning in the east has been oriented around a single geographic objective, the fortress belt. This is the fortified urban corridor, anchored by the cities of Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Kostiantynivka, and Druzhkivka. These 4 cities form an interlocking defensive rectangle in central Donetsk Oblast, connected by fortified lines, natural terrain features, and defensive infrastructure that Ukraine has been reinforcing for years. Military analysts at the Institute for the Study of War have repeatedly identified this corridor as the central prize of Russia's eastern campaign. Crack the fortress belt, and Moscow would shatter the structural backbone of Ukrainian defense in Donetsk, potentially opening the path to the broader administrative region that Russia has claimed but never fully controlled. Beginning in early 2026, Russia committed to making that breakthrough happen. 3 separate army groups were assembled around the fortress belt perimeter: the Southern Group, the Central Group, and the Western Group, collectively representing a concentration of combat power that Russian military planners described internally as sufficient to resolve the Donetsk question within a single campaign season. The 20th Guards, combined arms. Army formed the assault corps designated to punch through the center of the Ukrainian line. The 1st Guards Tank Army, a formation with a lineage stretching back through decades of Soviet and Russian military history, was positioned to drive toward Pokrovsk and break Ukrainian defensive coherence with massed armor. The 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division was staged for a grinding attritional assault aimed directly at Kostiantynivka. French military analyst Clément Moulin documented this buildup in detail. 18 brigades, 8 full divisions, an effective force exceeding 100,000 soldiers when accounting for rotational replacements. Russian state media treated the buildup as a fait accompli. Television propagandists were declaring that the fortress belt would fall before summer. Generals reportedly assured President Putin that this operation would deliver the decisive result that previous offensives had failed to produce. On paper, the force was formidable. On paper, it looked difficult to stop. Ukraine was not planning to stop it on paper. While Russia assembled its mass, Ukraine was constructing something that could not be seen on any satellite image, could not be detected by any reconnaissance drone, and could not be measured in any order of battle assessment. A trap. The trap did not depend on matching Russian numbers. Ukraine understood, with clarity earned through 3 years of fighting, that numerical parity against a country with Russia's population and industrial base was not a realistic or even a necessary objective. What mattered was identifying the structural weakness inside Russia's operational approach and attacking it with precision before the main assault could develop momentum. The structural weakness was the supply chain, and the formation selected to exploit that weakness was the Azov First Corps. Azov carries a weight in this war that goes beyond its military designation. It was forged in the siege of Mariupol, one of the most brutal urban battles in modern European history. The unit's reputation was built on resilience under conditions that would have broken most formations. But what Azov became in the period between Mariupol and the Fortress Belt campaign is something considerably more sophisticated than the unit that emerged from those ruins. It has become one of the most technologically integrated military formations in the Ukrainian armed forces, and in the Fortress Belt, that transformation became the decisive operational factor of the entire campaign. Here is the architecture of how the trap was built. On the visible layer, Ukraine positioned its mechanized brigades and infantry formations along the forward defensive lines. These units constructed hardened positions, established minefields, and prepared to absorb the Russian assault. They were the wall that Russia could see and plan against. Behind that wall, several kilometers removed from the front, operating from hardened underground facilities, Azov's technological component ran a parallel war that the Russian assault force could not locate, could not target, and could not suppress. Inside those underground command nodes, software engineers worked alongside drone operators on a continuous cycle. Digital maps displayed real-time battlefield data, updated through multiple sensor streams. Encrypted communication systems were updated daily to stay ahead of Russian electronic warfare frequency shifts. The work was not reconnaissance in the traditional military sense. It was network management, maintaining the coherence of a distributed attack system operating across hundreds of square kilometers of contested terrain. The primary strike asset was the Hornet loitering munition. Equipped with artificial intelligence target recognition and an operational range of approximately 160 kilometers, the Hornet could be launched from positions well behind the forward line, guided through Russian electronic jamming via Starlink satellite integration, and held on station above target areas for extended periods. Loitering munitions do not need to commit to an attack immediately. They can circle, they can wait, they can select the optimal engagement window. The AI targeting system on the Hornet could identify vehicles concealed under camouflage netting by reading their thermal signatures, the heat from engines, from exhaust, from the density of personnel gathered around a vehicle. When a Hornet locked onto a fuel tanker or an ammunition transport, the precision was sufficient to target the most vulnerable points of that vehicle: the engine compartment, the fuel tank, the cargo bed. A single strike on an ammunition transport carrying artillery shells or rocket propellant does not destroy one vehicle. It initiates a detonation chain that can eliminate an entire convoy cluster within seconds. But the technology alone did not make this strategy work. The genius of the approach was the selection of what to target. Russian military doctrine, inherited from Soviet operational thinking and never fundamentally reformed, depends on a massive rear logistics architecture. Ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies are concentrated in large depot facilities positioned well behind the contact line. From those depots, supplies are moved forward by rail as far as the rail network reaches. But rail infrastructure does not extend to the front. In the final 30 kilometers before the forward defensive lines, everything must transfer to road transport, specifically to unarmored KAMAZ trucks operating along routes that follow predictable corridors, dictated by road quality and bridge capacity. Those trucks have no armor, no active protection systems, no electronic countermeasures. They must travel fixed routes on a predictable schedule because the units they are supplying operate on fixed consumption cycles. That 30 kilometers gap between the railhead and the front line was the killing zone, and Azov owned it completely. Along the Ampil, Siversk, and Lyman axes, every significant road junction, every bridge crossing, every identified convoy route became a permanent hunting ground for Hornet strikes and FPV drone teams. Russian truck drivers were ordered to travel without headlights, using darkness as concealment. Azov's drones carried thermal imaging. Darkness provided no protection. Destroyed trucks accumulated along the routes, creating choke points that forced subsequent convoys to slow, stop, or attempt detours across terrain unsuited to heavy vehicle operations. Some drivers abandoned their trucks entirely and dispersed on foot into adjacent forest. The convoys that did attempt to push through were met with strikes from above that they could neither detect in advance nor defend against in the moment. Now, consider what this means at the human level. A soldier in a forward trench can endure artillery fire. He can endure the psychological pressure of knowing enemy forces are 200 meters away. He can endure almost anything except the slow, certain knowledge that his food is not coming, his ammunition is running low, and no one is coming to evacuate his wounded. When the supply line is severed, combat power does not decline gradually. It collapses, and that collapse begins not at the front, but in the minds of the men in the forward positions. The moment they understand that their own rear echelon has lost the ability to reach them. The first Russian formation to experience this in full was the 1st Donetsk Army Corps. Beginning in April 2026, Azov launched coordinated swarm operations targeting the Donetsk Ring Road, the primary logistics artery feeding the Corps' forward positions. The junctions around Zelenivka and Starivka, which Russian planners had designated as key nodes in the forward supply chain, became what Ukrainian soldiers described in intercepted communications as an open-air vehicle graveyard. Burnt transport trucks lined both sides of the road. Ammunition shipments stopped. Rotation schedules for exhausted units were canceled because the vehicles that would have moved replacement soldiers to the front could not safely travel the route. The 1st Donetsk Army Corps, designated as one of the anchor formations in Russia's fortress belt assault, could not advance, could not rotate, could not be resupplied. Intercepted radio communications from this period revealed a picture of progressive collapse, soldiers requesting basic supplies that were acknowledged at command level but never delivered, medical evacuation requests going unanswered because evacuation vehicles were being destroyed on the approach routes, unit commanders reporting degraded combat effectiveness to superiors who had no solution to offer. The formations were not being defeated in direct combat. They were being strangled by the systematic removal of everything that made combat possible. The 1st Guards Tank Army on the Pokrovsk axis experienced the same dynamic through a different mechanism. Russia's most capable armored formation had been positioned to deliver the armored breakthrough that would shatter Ukrainian defensive coherence across the central sector. Its T-90M tanks represented the best hardware in Russia's ground force inventory, but tanks consume fuel at extraordinary rates. The T-90M at combat speed burns through its fuel load in hours, not days. The fuel convoys designated to sustain the armored advance were destroyed on the approach routes before they reached the forward assembly areas. Multi-ton armored vehicles became static defensive obstacles, immobile in the terrain they had been sent across. The highway designations T-05, 09, and M-14, which Russian planners had identified as the primary armored approach routes, became zones of consistent strike activity. Every kilometer was under persistent drone observation. Every bridge was a potential target. Russian commanders attempting to push fuel forward through these corridors reported losing multiple vehicles per delivery attempt, a logistical exchange rate that made sustained offensive operations mathematically impossible. The Pokrovsk offensive, positioned as the centerpiece of Russia's 2026 summer campaign, stalled within weeks of its initiation and did not recover. The same pattern propagated across every axis. The 3rd Motor Rifle Division on the Siversk axis exhausted its locally held ammunition stocks and could not advance a single tactical position. The 20th Guards, Combined Arms Army, approaching Sloviansk from the Lyman direction, found its supply situation deteriorating faster than its forward progress could compensate for. Russia attempted to offset the ground logistics failure with air power launching over 800 airstrikes across the Fortress Belt region throughout May. But airstrikes consume fuel and ordnance and cannot hold territory. Ground forces hold territory, and ground forces need ammunition and food. The 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division, along with its subordinate 71st and 291st Regiments, found itself caught between two simultaneous pressures. From the front, Ukraine's fortified defensive lines absorbed and degraded every assault attempt. From the rear, Azov's strike network destroyed every convoy attempting to sustain those assault attempts. Between these two fires, the division suffered casualties at a rate that degraded its effective combat strength faster than replacement personnel could be cycled in. Then, Azov shifted to a 3rd category of targets. Russian mobile command posts, communications relay stations, and electronic warfare platforms in the rear area became the priority. When these nodes were struck, Russian officers lost the ability to communicate with subordinate units in the field. Artillery batteries received no targeting data and fired on fixed coordinates or not at all. Regimental commanders could not coordinate with adjacent formations. The assault that was supposed to represent coordinated pressure across multiple axes disintegrated into isolated unit actions operating without common situational awareness. This was the culmination of the strategy. Russia's military command structure is built on centralized control. Orders flow from senior commanders downward with precision, timing, and coordination. That architecture is its strength when it functions. When the communications infrastructure supporting it is destroyed, the entire organism loses coherence simultaneously. There is no distributed fallback. There is no organic unit-level initiative embedded in the doctrine to compensate. When the network went down, the offensive went down with it. There had been an earlier proof of concept that, looking back, was a precise rehearsal for everything that followed at scale. In February 2026, Azov conducted a clearing operation in the Zolote-Kodaki forest zone lasting 21 days. The operational approach combined FPV drone interdiction with coordinated infantry pressure, preventing Russian forces from moving, receiving resupply, or evacuating casualties from their forest positions. 18 Russian soldiers, trapped in a degraded defensive position deep in the tree line, unable to raise their heads above the forest floor because of continuous drone activity above them, ran out of ammunition on day 19 and food on day 20. On day 21, they raised white flags. Not because they were outfought in direct combat, because a swarm of machines in the air above them had made their position untenable from a distance without exposing a single Ukrainian soldier to direct fire. That was a company-level demonstration. The Fortress Belt campaign applied the same logic to an army group. The strategic implications of what has occurred in the Fortress Belt extend beyond this specific campaign. Russia brought to this offensive the operational assumptions that have governed its military thinking since the Soviet era, that mass, when concentrated and properly supported, can overcome technical and tactical disadvantages through sheer weight of effort. 100,000 soldiers, 18 brigades, 8 divisions. The logic of accumulation applied at maximum scale. Ukraine built its response on a different premise, that the support infrastructure enabling that mass is the actual center of gravity, not the mass itself. Destroy the logistics, the communications, and the command nodes, and the mass becomes irrelevant. 100,000 soldiers without food, ammunition, and orders are not an army. They are a collection of isolated men in tactical positions, waiting for something that is not coming. The technology that made this possible, loitering munitions with AI targeting, Starlink-integrated drone networks, underground command facilities operating in contested electronic environments, represents a genuine evolution in how smaller forces can neutralize larger ones. Not through battlefield courage alone, though that has been present in abundance, through systematic, patient, technically sophisticated targeting of the one thing that converts raw military power into operational effect. Russia has attempted to adapt. In a response that illustrates how deeply the Azov approach disrupted the operational framework, Russian commanders pulled electronic warfare platforms from the forward contact line and redeployed them to the rear, attempting to provide some protection for the supply routes that were bleeding out under drone strike. The immediate consequence was predictable. Forward infantry positions lost the electronic warfare coverage that had been suppressing Ukrainian FPV drone operations at the front. Soldiers who were already short on ammunition and food were now also exposed to small drone attacks in their forward positions. A decision made to protect the rear created a new vulnerability at the front. There was no version of this problem that did not create a second problem somewhere else. Publicly available casualty estimates suggest that Russia has sustained total losses exceeding 1 million across all categories since the war's beginning. Replacement quality is declining as the pool of experienced military-age personnel is exhausted by attrition. Equipment losses in armored vehicles, artillery systems, and electronic warfare platforms are increasingly difficult to replace as sanctions continue to degrade the industrial base supporting military production. None of this translates into an immediate Russian collapse. Putin retains significant military capability. Missile and drone strikes against Ukrainian cities, including Kiev, continue with regularity and cause genuine civilian suffering. These strikes do not resolve the situation in the Fortress Belt, but they impose costs on Ukraine and maintain domestic political narratives about the war's progress. What they do not do is feed the 100,000 soldiers whose supply lines have been severed. They do not replace the tanks sitting immobile without fuel. They do not restore the communications networks that coordinated the offensive before Azov strike teams worked through them. The strategic question now confronting Moscow is the same one that authoritarian military hierarchies have faced across history when an offensive fails to achieve its objectives: absorb the cost, adjust, and attempt a different approach, or double down, feeding additional resources into an operational framework that has demonstrably failed to function. Historical patterns in authoritarian military systems suggest that retreat is the least preferred option when political credibility is attached to the campaign's success. The more likely trajectory is continued commitment to the fortress belt axis, with adjustments at the tactical level that do not address the fundamental operational problem that Azov's strategy has exposed. If that pattern holds, the fortress belt will continue consuming Russian combat power at a rate that the replacement pipeline will struggle to sustain. Not because Ukraine has found a way to win every engagement, because Ukraine has found a way to make every Russian soldier in that theater fight at a fraction of their potential effectiveness by denying them what any army, regardless of size, regardless of history, regardless of political will, cannot function without. What happens next in the fortress belt will shape not just the trajectory of this conflict, but the foundational assumptions about ground warfare that every military planning staff on Earth will work from for the next generation. Silent machines hovering in the sky above a logistics corridor have rewritten those assumptions. The question is, who absorbs that lesson first?